Over the past year, people from all over the world have been sending me stories they couldn't explain. Most of them start the same way. Not with something terrifying, just something small that doesn't make sense. A phone call that appears in a call log but never happened. A security camera recording motion when no one was there. A message sent from someone's account that they swear they never wrote. Usually, there's a logical explanation, a glitch, a mistake, a bad memory. But sometimes the person experiencing it keeps noticing things, little details, patterns, and that's when the story starts to feel different. The first story I'm sharing tonight came from someone named Daniel. His email began with a sentence that stuck with me long after I finished reading it. He wrote, "I found proof that I sent a message before I even wrote it." At first, I assumed he meant a scheduling mistake. Maybe a delayed message. Maybe a software glitch. Then I kept reading. Daniel works from home as a support technician for a software company. Most of his job involves monitoring systems, answering technical questions, and responding to coworkers through an internal messaging platform. It's quiet work, the kind where you spend most of the day staring at screens and waiting for something to break. According to Daniel, the first strange thing happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Nothing unusual about the day. He had already finished most of the support tickets in his queue and was working through a few internal messages from coworkers. One message asked about a scheduled server restart that night. The restart was supposed to happen at 2 a.m., routine maintenance. Nothing important. Daniel opened the message thread and started typing a reply. He wrote, "Yeah, the restart is still scheduled for 2 a.m. I'll confirm with the team later tonight." Before he hit send, he noticed something strange. The conversation thread already showed a reply from him. The exact same reply, same words, same punctuation, everything. For a moment, Daniel assumed he must have already sent it and forgotten. That happens sometimes when you're answering dozens of messages in a row. But when he looked closer, something didn't make sense. The message was time-stamped 1:37 p.m. Daniel looked at the clock on his computer. It said 1:14 p.m. He checked again. Still 1:14. The message had been sent 23 minutes in the future. Daniel stared at the screen for a few seconds, then laughed to himself. Not because it was funny, just because that's what people do when something feels strange, but you're trying not to overthink it. Messaging systems glitch all the time. Servers sync incorrectly. Timestamps jump forward or backward. It had to be something like that. So Daniel deleted the message he had been typing and moved on to the next support ticket. Within a few minutes, he had forgotten about it. Until the reply came in. A new message appeared in the thread. From his coworker. It said, "Perfect, thanks for confirming." The timestamp on the reply read 1:38 p.m. Daniel slowly looked back at the clock on his computer. It still said 1:18 p.m. For the first time, the situation stopped feeling like a harmless glitch. He refreshed the messaging platform. The timestamps stayed the same. He checked the clock on his phone. Same time, 1:18, which meant something impossible had just happened. His account had sent a message 20 minutes before he wrote it, and someone had already replied to it. Daniel leaned back in his chair and stared at the screen. The message wasn't similar to what he planned to write. It was identical. Even the small typo he sometimes makes when writing the word confirm, that detail bothered him more than anything else, because it meant the message wasn't random. It was exactly what he had been about to send. Daniel scrolled through the rest of the conversation thread. That's when he noticed something he hadn't seen earlier. Another message from his account. Further down the conversation, the timestamp read 2:03 a.m. Daniel frowned because it was still the middle of the afternoon. That timestamp was 12 hours in the future. The message said, "Restart confirmed." He stared at it for a moment, then noticed the reply underneath. From his manager, timestamp 2:04 a.m. The message read, "Thanks for handling that." Daniel hovered his mouse over the message details. The system confirmed it had been sent from his account. No unusual login activity, no password alerts, nothing strange, just normal activity. Except for one detail Daniel couldn't explain. The confirmation message included a sentence he didn't recognize, something he was certain he had never written before. At the end of the message it said, "Everything worked, no one noticed." Daniel read that sentence 3 times, because he had no idea what it meant. The restart hadn't even happened yet, and according to the system, he had already reported that it worked. For the rest of the afternoon, Daniel kept checking the messaging platform. The messages didn't disappear. The timestamps didn't change. At one point, he casually asked his coworker about it. "Hey, did I confirm the restart earlier?" His coworker responded almost immediately. "Yeah, you messaged me a while ago." Daniel didn't answer, because according to the clock on his wall, he hadn't sent that message yet. And when he looked back at the conversation thread one more time, he noticed something new. There was another message scheduled later that night, from his account. Timestamp 3:12 a.m. The message hadn't been sent yet, but the system already displayed the text. Daniel felt a slow chill run down his arms as he read it, because the message said only one sentence. "I saw it moving in the hallway." And Daniel lived alone. Daniel stared at the message for a long time. "I saw it moving in the hallway." The timestamp said 3:12 a.m., but it was still early evening, hours before that message was supposed to exist. For a few seconds, he wondered if it was just another strange prediction like the earlier ones, a message that hadn't happened yet, something the system was somehow displaying ahead of time. But this one felt different, because unlike the earlier messages, Daniel knew he had never typed that sentence before, not today, not ever. And the wording bothered him. Not just what it said, but how it said it. "I saw it moving." Not someone, not something, just it. Daniel sat there for a while, staring at the screen. Eventually, he convinced himself the same thing he had earlier. It had to be a glitch. The system was probably pulling text from somewhere in a database and displaying it incorrectly. Or maybe the platform had some strange, delayed message feature he didn't know about. Whatever it was, the only way to prove it meant nothing was to ignore it. So Daniel finished his shift and shut down his computer for the night. But he couldn't stop thinking about that message. Around midnight, he was still awake. Not because he'd planned to stay up, but because the thought kept replaying in his mind. 3:12 a.m. I saw it moving in the hallway. Eventually, curiosity got the better of him. He opened his laptop again. The messaging platform loaded. The conversation thread was still there. The earlier messages hadn't changed. The restart confirmation still showed the future timestamp. And at the bottom of the conversation, the message about the hallway was still waiting. 3:12 a.m. Daniel checked the clock. 12:47 a.m. More than 2 hours before that message was supposed to appear. He stared at the screen for a while, then opened another window and began watching the server restart dashboard. If the system had predicted the earlier messages correctly, he wanted to see if the restart really would happen exactly the way it said. At 1:59 a.m., the system began running the restart sequence, just like it was scheduled to. Daniel watched the console messages scroll by. Connection closing. Services restarting. Temporary disconnect. Then the server came back online. everything looked normal. At 2:03 a.m., Daniel opened the messaging platform again, and the message was there. Restart confirmed. Exactly the same one he had seen earlier that afternoon. Same timestamp, same wording, and underneath it, the reply from his manager appeared seconds later. "Thanks for handling that." Daniel felt a strange sinking feeling in his chest, because the system hadn't just predicted the message, it had predicted the exact time it would happen, which meant the next message might not be random either. The one about the hallway. Daniel sat in his chair, staring at the clock. The minutes moved slowly. 2, 22, 37, 2:55. By the time it reached 3:10 a.m., the house was completely silent. Daniel lived alone in a small house at the end of a quiet street. The hallway the message mentioned was only a few steps away from his office door. He could see the entrance to it from where he was sitting. The lights were off. Everything was still. At 3:11, Daniel refreshed the messaging platform. The conversation thread updated. The message at the bottom shifted slightly. The timestamp changed. 3:12 a.m., and the message officially appeared in the conversation history. I saw it moving in the hallway. Daniel felt his stomach tighten, because he hadn't typed anything. His hands were resting on the desk. He hadn't even touched the keyboard. Yet the message had been sent from his account. Daniel slowly turned his head toward the hallway. The doorway looked the same as it always did. Dark, quiet, empty. For a moment, he almost laughed at himself. This was ridiculous. He was letting a weird software glitch get inside his head. He turned back toward the computer. That's when he noticed something else. A new message had appeared. From his account. Timestamp, 3:13 a.m. Daniel leaned forward slowly. The message read, "I think it knows I can see it." Daniel's throat went dry, because he still hadn't typed anything. He slowly looked back toward the hallway. At first, everything seemed normal, but then he noticed something. The hallway wasn't completely dark anymore. A faint shadow stretched across the floor, like something was standing just out of view around the corner. Daniel sat frozen in his chair, waiting, watching. Nothing moved. The shadow didn't shift. The house stayed silent. After a few minutes, he stood up and walked slowly to the doorway. The hallway was empty. Every room was exactly how he had left it. No open doors, no movement, nothing. Eventually, Daniel went back to his desk. He checked the messaging platform again. The two messages were still there, the ones he never typed. I saw it moving in the hallway. "I think it knows I can see it." Daniel shut down the computer. He didn't want to look at the system anymore. Not that night. Maybe not ever. The next morning, Daniel opened the messaging platform again. He wanted to see if the messages were still there. The conversation thread looked normal. The restart confirmation was still there. His manager's reply was still there. But the two messages from 3:12 and 3:13 a.m. were gone. Completely gone. No record of them, no edit history, nothing. Daniel sat back in his chair, trying to decide if he had imagined the whole thing. Then he noticed something new. A message at the bottom of the thread. From his account. Timestamp, 3:18 a.m. Daniel stared at it, because he didn't remember writing anything at 3:18. The message read, "It's still standing there." And underneath it, another message from his account. 3:19 a.m. I don't think it's going to leave. The next story came from someone who said the situation didn't feel frightening at first. It just felt strange. Most apartment buildings have one. The person no one really knows. They don't talk to anyone. They don't have visitors. And after a while, people just get used to the idea that they're always there. The story I'm about to tell was sent to me by someone named Alicia. She had lived in the same apartment building for almost 3 years before she started noticing something strange about the man who lived across the hallway. At first, there was nothing unusual about him. He was quiet, kept to himself. Probably in his late 40s or early 50s. The kind of neighbor you see occasionally when you're checking the mail or taking out the trash. Alicia said they had spoken maybe 3 times total, just normal hallway conversations. Good morning. Have a good night. Nothing more. But one thing about him slowly started to bother her. He was always home. At first, it didn't seem strange. Some people work from home. Some people work night shifts. People have different schedules. But after a few months, Alicia started noticing something. No matter what time she left or came back, his door was always closed, and the light inside his apartment was always on. Morning, afternoon, late at night, the light never turned off. At first, she thought it was just a hallway reflection. Sometimes the light from an apartment spills out underneath the door, but this was different. There was always a narrow line of light visible under the door frame, even in the middle of the day, even when the rest of the hallway was dark. Eventually, Alicia mentioned it to another neighbor while they were both checking the mail. "Does the guy across from me ever leave?" The neighbor shrugged. "I don't think I've ever seen him go anywhere." That answer stuck with Alicia longer than it should have, because once she started thinking about it, she realized something strange. She hadn't seen him leave either, not once, and she had lived there for years. A few weeks passed before Alicia noticed the next thing. It happened one evening when she was coming home from work. She stepped out of the elevator and walked down the hallway toward her apartment. As she got closer, she saw the man standing in his doorway, not outside, just inside. The door was open a few inches, and he was standing there in the dark, watching the hallway. At first, Alicia assumed he was about to leave, but he didn't move. He just stood there. The apartment behind him was completely dark. The only light came from the hallway. For a moment, they made eye contact. Then he slowly closed the door. The click of the lock echoed down the hallway. Alicia said the moment felt strange, but she tried to ignore it. People do weird things sometimes. Maybe he was just checking to see if a package had arrived. Still, the image stuck in her mind, because the hallway light had briefly illuminated part of the inside of his apartment, and she noticed something unusual. There was almost nothing inside. No furniture near the entrance, no decorations, just empty floor. The next time she saw him was a few days later. It was around 2 a.m. Alicia had woken up and gone to the kitchen to get some water. As she walked back toward her bedroom, she heard something in the hallway outside her apartment. Footsteps, slow ones, back and forth. At first, she thought someone was just walking past her door, but the footsteps didn't fade away. They kept moving, back and forth, up and down the hallway for several minutes. Eventually, curiosity got the better of her. She walked to the door and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. The lights were on. The carpet looked undisturbed. But she could still hear the footsteps, somewhere out there, moving slowly across the floor. And then she realized something. The sound wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from the apartment across from hers, the one with the light that never turned off. Alicia stayed at the door for almost a minute, listening. The footsteps continued, slow, measured, back and forth, like someone pacing the same path over and over again. Eventually, they stopped. The hallway became completely silent. Alicia stepped away from the door and went back to bed. But she couldn't sleep, because once she started paying attention, she began noticing something even stranger. The footsteps started happening almost every night, and they always began around the same time, just after 2 a.m. A week later, Alicia decided to ask the building manager about it. She mentioned the noise casually. "Do you know if the guy across from me works nights or something?" The manager frowned slightly. "Which apartment?" Alicia told him the number. For a moment, the manager looked confused. Then he said something that made Alicia feel a slow chill run through her chest. "That apartment's been empty for months." Alicia thought he was joking, but he wasn't smiling. He pulled up the tenant records on his computer. The previous tenant had moved out nearly 4 months earlier. No new lease had been signed. According to the building system, no one had been living there at all. But Alicia knew that wasn't possible, because she had seen someone standing in that doorway, and every night at 2 a.m., she could hear him walking around inside. When the building manager told Alicia the apartment had been empty for months, she assumed he had the wrong unit. "There's definitely someone living there," she said. "I see him sometimes." The manager shook his head. "No one's rented that unit since February." He turned the computer screen toward her. The lease record was right there. The previous tenant had moved out. Maintenance had cleaned the apartment. Since then, the unit had stayed vacant. Alicia left the office feeling uneasy, because she knew what she had seen. A man standing inside the doorway, watching the hallway, and every night, the footsteps, back and forth. Always around 2 a.m. That night, Alicia paid closer attention. At 1:55 a.m., she turned off the television and sat quietly on the couch. The apartment was completely silent. The hallway light outside her door cast a faint glow along the floor. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then, right on time, the footsteps started. Slow, heavy, back and forth, exactly like before. Alicia stood up and walked to the door. The sound was definitely coming from the apartment across the hallway, not the hallway itself, inside the unit. Someone pacing. She leaned closer to the peephole. The hallway was empty, but something about the apartment across from hers looked different. For the first time, she noticed that the line of light under the door wasn't there anymore. The floor beneath the door was completely dark, which meant the lights inside that apartment were off, but the footsteps were still happening. Back and forth, like someone walking through a completely dark room. Alicia stayed there listening. The pacing continued for nearly 10 minutes. Then suddenly it stopped. Total silence. The kind that makes the entire building feel empty. After a while, Alicia stepped away from the door, but the thought stayed with her. If the apartment was empty, who was walking around inside it every night? The next afternoon, she ran into the building manager again. This time, she insisted, "There's someone inside that apartment." The manager sighed. "You're probably hearing pipes or something." But Alicia shook her head. "I've seen him." That made the manager pause. Eventually, he said he would check the unit that evening, just to be sure. Around 6 p.m., Alicia heard keys jingling in the hallway. She opened her door slightly. The building manager was standing in front of the empty apartment with a maintenance worker. The manager unlocked the door. For a moment, the door stayed closed. Then he pushed it open. The lights inside flicked on. From where Alicia stood, she could see straight into the apartment. And what she saw made her stomach drop. The place was completely empty. Bare floors, bare walls, no furniture, no decorations, nothing. Exactly like the manager had said. The maintenance worker stepped inside and walked through each room. "Looks normal," he said. The manager nodded. "See? Nobody here." Alicia felt a strange mix of relief and confusion. Maybe she had misunderstood the sounds. Maybe the footsteps had been coming from somewhere else. Maybe the man she saw in the doorway had been someone visiting another apartment. Eventually, the manager locked the door again. The hallway returned to normal. But that night, at 2 a.m., the footsteps started again. This time, Alicia knew she wasn't imagining it. The pacing sounded exactly the same. Back and forth. Slow. Measured. The sound of shoes on the hardwood floor. She walked to the door and listened carefully. It was definitely coming from the empty apartment, which meant someone had to be inside. After a few minutes, the footsteps stopped. Alicia went back to bed, but she barely slept. The next morning, something strange happened. As Alicia stepped out into the hallway to leave for work, she noticed something lying on the carpet in front of the empty apartment door. A small piece of paper. She bent down and picked it up. It looked like a receipt. But when she turned it over, she saw writing on the back. 2 words, written in shaky handwriting. Still here. Alicia felt a cold chill move through her chest because she recognized the handwriting immediately. It was the same handwriting she had seen on a package label weeks earlier. The package that had been sitting outside the empty apartment, addressed to the man she had seen standing in the doorway. That night, Alicia stayed awake again, just waiting. At 2:01 a.m., the footsteps started, back and forth, exactly like before. But this time, something was different. They stopped much sooner. Only a few minutes. Then she heard something else. A soft, creaking sound, like a door slowly opening. Alicia walked quietly to her front door and looked through the peephole. The hallway light illuminated the carpet, and directly across from her, the door of the supposedly empty apartment was open a few inches. Alicia held her breath. The apartment inside was completely dark, but something was standing just inside the doorway. She couldn't see its face, only the outline of a person, perfectly still, watching the hallway, watching her door. After a few seconds, the figure slowly stepped backward, the door closed, and the lock clicked. The next morning, Alicia went straight to the building manager. But when she told him what she saw, he just stared at her for a moment. Then he said something that made her blood run cold. "That apartment doesn't have a lock." Alicia frowned. "What do you mean?" The manager opened the maintenance log. "The door hardware broke months ago. We removed the lock until the replacement came in." He pointed to the record on the screen. According to the system, that door couldn't lock at all. But Alicia had heard it the night before. The sound of a deadbolt turning, and something closing itself inside the apartment, where no one was supposed to be living. A lot of the stories people send me happen while they're traveling. Remote highways, small towns, cabins in the woods, places where something unusual can happen without anyone else noticing. This story came from someone named Marcus. He said it happened during a camping trip he took with 2 friends late last summer. They had planned the trip for weeks. A quiet campground several hours away from the nearest city. The kind of place people go when they want to be completely away from everything. No cell service, no nearby towns, just forest, mountains, and a small campground maintained by the Park Service. Marcus said the campground had about 12 sites total, spread out along a narrow dirt road that ran through the trees. Each site had a fire pit, a small clearing for tents, and a wooden post with the site number carved into it. When Marcus and his friends arrived late in the afternoon, the place looked almost empty. They passed one RV near the entrance, but the rest of the road looked quiet. Their reservation was for Site 8 near the far end of the campground. When they pulled into the clearing, everything looked normal. No vehicles, no tents, no people. But something about the site immediately caught Marcus's attention. The fire pit still had ashes inside it, and they didn't look old. The ashes were gray and powdery, but in the center of the pit there were still a few dark chunks of charcoal. Marcus stepped out of the car and walked over to look. When he crouched down near the pit, he noticed something else. The ashes were still warm. Not hot, but warm enough that he could feel heat rising from the center, which meant someone had used the fire pit recently. Very recently. Marcus mentioned it to his friends. One of them shrugged. Probably someone who left earlier today. That seemed like a reasonable explanation. People come and go from campgrounds all the time. So they didn't think much of it. They unpacked their gear, set up 2 tents, and started gathering wood for their own fire. For the next couple of hours, everything felt normal. They cooked dinner, talked around the fire, watched the sky grow darker as the forest settled into nighttime. Eventually, the campground became completely quiet. The RV they had passed earlier must have left, because they never saw lights or heard voices from any of the other sites. By the time the fire burned low, it felt like they had the entire campground to themselves. Marcus said that was the moment he first noticed something strange. Not something he could see, just a feeling. The kind you get when you suddenly realize how quiet everything is. The forest around them had gone completely still. No wind, no insects, no distant sounds from other campsites. Just the faint crackle of the fire. Marcus stood up and stretched. As he did, he looked toward the tree line surrounding their campsite. At first, everything looked normal. Tall, dark trees, shadows stretching between them. But after a moment, he noticed something that made him pause. About 20 yards away, between 2 trees, someone was standing there. At first, Marcus assumed it was another camper. Maybe someone walking through the campground. But the person wasn't moving. They were just standing there, half hidden by the darkness between the trees, watching the campsite. Marcus leaned closer to the firelight, trying to see better. The figure was hard to make out, but it looked like a man. Tall, thin, standing perfectly still. Marcus pointed toward the trees. "Hey, do you guys see that?" His friends turned. For a few seconds, none of them said anything. Then, one of them spoke quietly. "Yeah, I see him." The figure didn't move, didn't step forward, didn't say anything, just stood there in the darkness, watching them. Eventually, Marcus called out, "Hey!" No response. "Are you looking for something?" Still nothing. The figure stayed where it was, perfectly still. After a few seconds, Marcus felt a little uneasy. Most people would at least respond if someone spoke to them, even if it was just to say hello. But this person didn't react at all. Finally, Marcus's friend stood up and took a few steps toward the trees. "Hey man, this site's taken." The figure moved then, not toward them. Just one slow step backward into the darkness, then another. Within a few seconds, the trees swallowed him completely. Gone. Marcus and his friend stood there for a moment, trying to decide what they had just seen. Eventually, one of them laughed nervously, probably someone from another campsite. That explanation made sense. There were other sites along the road. Someone might have been walking through the woods, but Marcus couldn't stop thinking about something. The direction the figure had come from. It wasn't another campsite. It was deeper in the forest, where there weren't any trails, and no campsites at all. Still, they tried to ignore it. Eventually, the fire burned down. One by one, they crawled into their tents. The forest stayed quiet. For a while. Marcus said he must have fallen asleep quickly, because the next thing he remembered was waking up suddenly in the middle of the night. At first, he didn't know why. The forest was still. The campsite was dark. But then he heard it. Footsteps. slow ones, moving somewhere just outside the tents. And as Marcus held his breath and listened, he realized the footsteps were circling the campsite, walking slowly around them, like someone checking to see if they were asleep. Marcus didn't move. He stayed completely still inside the tent, listening. The footsteps were slow, careful, the kind of steps someone takes when they're trying not to wake anyone. They moved across the gravel near the fire pit, then through the dirt beside the tents, then back again, a slow circle. Marcus glanced toward the faint outline of his friend in the other tent. The zipper on the fabric shifted slightly, which meant his friend was awake too. The footsteps continued. Whoever it was didn't speak, didn't use a flashlight, just kept walking, around and around the campsite. Marcus tried to convince himself it was another camper, maybe someone from another site looking for the restroom or the road, but the footsteps never left. They just kept circling. After several minutes, the sound stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Marcus waited. 30 seconds, a minute. Nothing. Finally, he slowly unzipped the tent. The zipper sounded painfully loud in the quiet forest. He pushed the flap open and looked outside. The campsite was empty. The fire pit was dark. The trees stood motionless in the moonlight. Marcus stepped out of the tent. His two friends came out moments later. "You heard that too, right?" one of them whispered. Marcus nodded. They all looked toward the tree line, but nothing moved. Eventually, one of them grabbed a flashlight and swept the beam through the trees, branches, trunks, shadows. No one there. Marcus turned the light toward the ground. That's when he noticed something strange. Footprints. In the dirt around the campsite. A full circle of them. Someone had definitely been walking there. The prints were fresh, but they weren't normal footprints. They looked uneven, like the person walking had been dragging one foot slightly with every step. Marcus followed the prints with the flashlight. They circled the tents once, then twice, then 3 times. Eventually, they led away from the campsite, back toward the same patch of trees where they had seen the figure earlier that night. Marcus's friend frowned. That's weird. What? These prints? Marcus shined the flashlight closer. Now that he was looking carefully, he saw what his friend meant. All the prints faced the campsite. None of them faced away, which meant whoever made them had been walking sideways, slowly circling the tents, while facing them the entire time, watching. The 3 of them stood there for a moment trying to decide what to do. Eventually, Marcus said the same thing everyone else was thinking. "Let's just go back to sleep." No one argued. They crawled back into their tents, but Marcus barely slept for the rest of the night. Every sound in the forest made him tense up. Branches shifting, leaves moving, even the wind. Morning finally arrived slowly. Sunlight filtered through the trees. Birds started making noise again. The forest felt normal, almost peaceful. Marcus stepped outside his tent and stretched. For a moment, everything seemed fine. Then he looked toward the fire pit and noticed something that hadn't been there the night before. A small pile of sticks, neatly arranged, directly in the center of the fire pit. Marcus frowned. "Did one of you do that?" His friends stepped out of their tents. They looked at the fire pit. Both of them shook their heads. No. Marcus walked closer. The sticks weren't random. Someone had arranged them carefully, like the beginning of a fire. But that wasn't the strange part. In the middle of the sticks was a small piece of folded paper. Marcus reached down and picked it up. The paper was damp from the morning air. He unfolded it slowly. Inside were 3 words, written in rough, uneven handwriting. You took my spot." Marcus looked around the campsite. The forest was quiet again. The other campsites down the road looked empty. No people, no vehicles, nothing. Marcus felt a slow uneasiness creeping into his chest, because the message didn't make sense. They had reserved that campsite weeks earlier, and when they arrived, it had been empty. But someone clearly thought otherwise. Marcus crumpled the paper in his hand. "Let's pack up." One of his friends looked confused. "Why?" Marcus glanced toward the trees, the same place where they had seen the figure the night before. "I just don't feel like staying here anymore." No one argued. Within 20 minutes, they had packed their gear and loaded the car. As Marcus started the engine, he glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The campsite looked exactly the same as when they arrived. Empty, quiet, still. But just before they pulled onto the dirt road, Marcus noticed something standing between the trees, far back in the forest. The same tall figure they had seen the night before, standing perfectly still, watching them leave. Marcus didn't slow down. He drove straight out of the campground. They didn't stop until they reached the highway, hours later. But before Marcus lost cell service that morning, he decided to do one thing. He looked up the campground online, just out of curiosity. He wanted to see if anyone had ever reported strange activity there. What he found instead was a short news article from several years earlier. A missing person case. A man who had been living in the forest near that campground. Someone who had refused to leave the area even after rangers warned him repeatedly. According to the article, the man had claimed that Site 8 belonged to him, and he had been camping there for nearly 3 months. Until the day he disappeared. The search teams never found him, but Marcus says he's sure about one thing. The man in the trees that night looked exactly like the photo in that article. When I first read the message that came with this next story, I assumed there had to be a normal explanation. But the more details I read, the harder that became to believe. A lot of the stories people send me start with something that seems harmless. A small coincidence. Something easy to ignore, but when the same thing keeps happening again and again, it stops feeling like coincidence. The story I'm about to tell was sent to me by someone named Tyler. He said it started with a car he kept noticing on his drive to work. Tyler worked early morning shifts at a warehouse outside his city. Every weekday, he left his house at around 5:40 a.m. The drive to work was about 20 minutes. Same route every day, same quiet streets, same highway entrance. For the first few months, the drive was completely routine. But one morning, Tyler noticed a car behind him that he didn't recognize. A dark sedan. Older model, nothing special about it. At first, he didn't think about it at all. Cars pass each other on the road all the time. But when he pulled into the employee parking lot at work, the same car turned in behind him. That still didn't seem strange. Hundreds of people work there. It could easily belong to another employee. Tyler parked, got out, and walked into the building. He forgot about the car almost immediately, until the next day. The following morning, the same thing happened. Tyler left his house at 5:40 a.m. He drove the same route. And when he stopped at a red light 2 blocks from his street, he noticed the same dark sedan behind him. Again. He watched it in the rearview mirror. The driver stayed several car lengths back. Not unusually close, not unusually far, just following the same turns. Tyler merged onto the highway. The sedan merged too. He exited near the warehouse. The sedan exited behind him, and once again, it pulled into the same parking lot. That was the first moment Tyler felt a small sense of unease, because the odds of the same car taking the exact same route 2 mornings in a row felt strange. Still, he told himself it was nothing. Someone else probably lived in the same neighborhood and worked nearby. It happens. But on the third morning, something different happened. Tyler left his house like usual, 5:40 a.m. But when he reached the end of his street, the sedan was already there, parked along the curb, engine running. Tyler slowed down as he passed it. For a moment, he thought the driver might be someone waiting for directions or checking their phone. But as Tyler drove past, the car pulled away from the curb and followed him again. Same distance, same turns, same exit, same parking lot. That's when Tyler started paying closer attention. Because this time the car didn't park in the employee lot, it stopped across the street and stayed there. The driver never got out. For the rest of the day, Tyler tried to convince himself it meant nothing. People park near workplaces all the time. Maybe the driver was waiting for someone. Maybe they worked nearby. But when Tyler left work that afternoon, the car was still there, parked in the same spot across the street. Tyler walked to his truck slowly. The sedan didn't move. He started the engine, still nothing. But the moment he pulled out of the parking lot, the sedan started its engine too, and followed him again, this time all the way home. Tyler watched the rearview mirror the entire drive. The car never passed him, never got close, just stayed behind, several car lengths back, watching. When Tyler turned onto his street, the sedan slowed down. It didn't follow him all the way. Instead, it stopped at the corner. The engine stayed running. Tyler pulled into his driveway and sat there for a moment, looking back toward the street. The sedan was still at the corner. After a few seconds, it drove away. Tyler went inside and tried to forget about it, but something about the situation kept bothering him, because the driver had never once tried to pass him, never changed lanes, never taken a different turn, just followed. The next morning, Tyler decided to leave for work a little earlier, 5:20 a.m. He wanted to see if the car would still appear. For the first few minutes, the streets were empty. No vehicles behind him. No headlights in the mirror. Tyler felt a sense of relief. Maybe it had all been coincidence. Maybe someone had just been taking the same route for a few days. But as he approached the highway entrance, he noticed headlights turning onto the road behind him. A dark sedan. The same one. Tyler's stomach tightened, because this time he was certain of something. The car hadn't just happened to be behind him. It had found him. Tyler exited the highway near his workplace, but instead of turning into the warehouse parking lot, he kept driving. He wanted to see what the sedan would do. For a moment, the car stayed behind him. Then, something happened that made Tyler's hands tighten on the steering wheel. The sedan moved closer, much closer than before. Close enough that Tyler could finally see the driver through the windshield. But the person behind the wheel wasn't looking at the road. They were looking directly at him, smiling. The person who sent this next story said they almost didn't share it, because even now, they still aren't sure what actually happened. The next story was sent to me by someone named Ryan. He said this happened about 2 years ago, not long after he moved into a small rental house just outside the city. The place wasn't anything special. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, small kitchen, older neighborhood. Ryan had moved there mostly because the rent was cheap and the location was close to his job. For the first few weeks, everything felt normal. Quiet street, friendly neighbors, nothing unusual. The first strange thing Ryan noticed was the kitchen cabinet. One evening, he came home from work and saw that one of the cabinet doors was open. It wasn't wide open, just slightly. At first, he assumed he had left it that way earlier in the morning. People forget small things like that all the time. So he closed it and didn't think much about it. But 2 days later, it happened again. Ryan came home and the same cabinet door was open. Again. only a few inches. Just enough that it caught his attention as soon as he walked into the kitchen. This time, he was pretty sure he hadn't left it that way. Still, it didn't seem like a big deal. Maybe the hinges were loose. Maybe the door didn't close all the way. So he shut it again and moved on. About a week later, Ryan noticed something else. He kept a box of cereal on the kitchen counter. One morning, when he went to pour a bowl, the box felt lighter than it should have. At first, he assumed he had eaten more of it than he remembered. But when he opened the box, something seemed strange. The inner plastic bag had been folded closed in a way he never did. Ryan usually just rolled the top down. This time, it looked carefully twisted and tucked. He stared at it for a moment, then shook his head. Maybe he had done it without thinking. People do things automatically sometimes. Still, the thought lingered in the back of his mind. Over the next few weeks, small things like that kept happening. A chair in the living room slightly out of place. The bathroom light left on when he was certain he turned it off. A dish in the sink that he didn't remember using. None of it seemed serious on its own, but together it started creating a strange feeling, like someone else had been inside the house. Ryan tried to ignore it. He lived alone. No roommates. No one else had a key except the landlord, and the landlord lived in another town. So there wasn't really any logical explanation for someone entering the house. Eventually, Ryan convinced himself the same thing most people would. He was just forgetting things. Work had been stressful lately. Maybe he wasn't paying attention. Then one night, something happened that made him question everything. Ryan had gone to bed around midnight. He was asleep for a few hours before something woke him up. At first, he didn't know what it was. The house was quiet, completely silent, but something felt different. Ryan sat up in bed and listened. For a few seconds, he heard nothing. Then he heard it. A sound coming from somewhere in the house. A slow, creaking noise, like someone stepping on the wooden floorboards in the hallway. Ryan froze. The hallway outside his bedroom connected the kitchen and the living room. There was no reason anyone should be walking there. He lived alone. Ryan waited. Another step. Slow. Careful. The sound of weight shifting on old wood. Someone moving quietly through the house. Ryan's heart started beating faster. He reached over to grab his phone from the nightstand. The screen lit up the room faintly. For a moment, he considered calling the police, but then the footsteps stopped. The house became silent again. Ryan stayed awake for several minutes. Listening? Nothing? Eventually, he told himself it had probably been something else. Maybe the house settling. Old homes make strange noises at night sometimes. After a while, he lay back down and tried to sleep. The next morning, Ryan walked into the kitchen to make coffee. At first, everything looked normal. Then, he noticed something on the counter. The cereal box was gone. Ryan frowned. He checked the pantry. Nothing. Then he looked in the trash can. Still nothing. The cereal box had simply disappeared. Ryan stood there trying to remember if he had thrown it away the night before, but he couldn't recall doing that. As he turned to check the rest of the kitchen, something else caught his attention. The back door. It was slightly open, just a few inches. Ryan felt a slow chill move through his chest, because he always locked that door before going to bed. Every night, without fail. He walked over and pushed the door closed. Then he noticed something lying on the floor just inside the doorway. A spoon. One of the spoons from his kitchen drawer. Ryan stared at it for a moment, because the spoon was covered in cereal crumbs, like someone had used it recently. And suddenly, Ryan realized something that made his stomach tighten. if someone had eaten the cereal. Then, whoever had taken it must have still been inside the house the night before, walking through the hallway while he was asleep. Ryan stood in the kitchen staring at the spoon on the floor. For a few seconds he didn't move. His mind was trying to come up with a simple explanation. Maybe he had dropped it earlier. Maybe the cereal box had been empty and he threw it away. But the crumbs on the spoon told a different story. Someone had used it recently, and the back door being open made the situation worse. Ryan knew he had locked that door the night before. He always checked it before going to bed, every night. He walked slowly through the rest of the kitchen. Nothing else looked disturbed. The cabinets were closed, the sink was empty, but something still felt wrong. Ryan checked the back door again. The lock was still in the locked position, which meant if someone had opened it, they must have locked it again before leaving. That thought stayed with him all day. Someone had been inside the house, and whoever it was had taken the time to lock the door on their way out. For the next couple of days, Ryan paid much closer attention to everything. He made sure every door was locked. He checked every window before going to bed, and he started noticing something else. The small strange things hadn't stopped. In fact, they were happening more often. A glass sitting on the counter when he knew he hadn't used one. The bathroom mirror slightly fogged when he hadn't taken a shower. Even the living room television once turned on by itself when he walked into the room. Ryan tried to tell himself it was just the house, old wiring, loose hinges, his imagination. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside, watching him, waiting until he was asleep. One night, Ryan decided to stay awake. He turned off the lights and sat quietly in the living room, just listening. Hours passed. Nothing happened. Eventually, he began to feel ridiculous. Maybe he had overreacted. Maybe he had just forgotten things. Around midnight, he went to bed, and for the first time in several nights, he slept deeply, until the sound woke him again. The same creaking floorboard, the same slow step, coming from the hallway. Ryan sat up immediately. The house was dark, but the sound was unmistakable. Someone walking through the house. The footsteps moved slowly across the hallway, then stopped outside his bedroom door. Ryan held his breath. The silence lasted several seconds. Then the footsteps continued, moving away again, back toward the kitchen. Ryan grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight. His heart was pounding now. This time he wasn't going to ignore it. He opened his bedroom door slowly. The hallway was empty. The house was silent again. Ryan stepped forward carefully. He checked the kitchen. Nothing. The living room, nothing. The bathroom, empty. For a moment he felt relief. Maybe the sound had been the house settling after all. Then he heard something. A faint sound above him. A small movement, like something shifting in the ceiling. Ryan slowly looked up. The house had a small attic space above the hallway. There was a square ceiling panel with a pull string attached to it. The attic hatch. Ryan had never used it before. He stared at it for a moment. The panel looked slightly crooked, like it hadn't closed all the way. Ryan felt a slow, cold realization forming in his mind. Because if someone had been inside the house, there was one place he hadn't checked: the attic. Ryan pulled a chair into the hallway and stood on it. His hands were shaking slightly as he grabbed the string. For a moment he hesitated. Part of him didn't want to know, but he pulled anyway. The attic hatch dropped open with a dull creaking sound. A wave of stale air drifted down from the dark space above. Ryan raised the flashlight and shined it upward. At first, he saw nothing, just wooden beams and insulation. Then the beam of light moved across the floorboards and stopped There was a sleeping bag up there, and next to it, an empty cereal box, Ryan's cereal box. Ryan slowly climbed down from the chair. His heart was racing now, because the sleeping bag wasn't the worst part. Beside it, on the attic floor, were several other things. Empty food wrappers, a water bottle, and a small pile of items Ryan recognized immediately. Things that had gone missing from his house over the past few weeks. The spoon, the glass, even a small flashlight from his kitchen drawer. Someone had been living up there, inside his attic, watching him for weeks, maybe longer. Ryan backed away slowly, then grabbed his phone and called the police. They arrived about 20 minutes later. 2 officers searched the attic with flashlights, but the space was empty. Whoever had been living there was gone. The only thing they found was the sleeping bag and a small notebook. Inside the notebook were dozens of pages filled with writing. Notes about Ryan's daily routine. What time he left the house, when he came back, when the lights turned off, when he went to sleep. The last entry in the notebook had been written the night before. It said only one sentence: "He almost found me tonight." Ryan moved out of that house the following week, but he says something still bothers him about the entire situation, because the police never found the person who had been living in his attic, and whoever it was had been watching him sleep for a long time, long enough to know exactly when it was safe to come down and eat his cereal in the middle of the night. Some of the messages I receive start with something small that seems unimportant. But later, that moment turns out to be the beginning of everything. This happened when I was working overnight security at an office building a few years ago. The building itself wasn't very big, 3 floors, mostly accounting firms and small tech companies. At night, the place was completely empty. My job was simple: walk the floors every hour, check that all the doors were locked, and keep an eye on the security cameras. The cameras covered the entrances, the hallways, and the stairwells. Nothing exciting ever happened there. Most nights, the hardest part of the job was staying awake. Around 1:40 a.m., I usually sat in the small security office near the front entrance and watched the monitors. There were 12 camera feeds total. Most of them showed empty hallways. The first strange thing happened on a Wednesday night. I was halfway through a shift and looking through the camera feeds when something caught my attention. One of the cameras was recording activity. That wasn't unusual. The system automatically records when it detects motion. But what made me pause was the timestamp. The recording said it had started at 2:11 a.m. I checked the clock on the wall. It was only 1:43 a.m. At first, I thought I had misread it, but the timestamp was clear. 2:11 a.m. The recording was from the camera in the 3rd floor hallway, which was strange because no one should have been there. I clicked the playback. The video opened. The hallway appeared on the screen. Empty. The lights were on, just like they always were at night. For a moment, nothing happened. Then something moved. At the far end of the hallway, near the emergency exit door, a shadow crossed the floor. It looked like someone stepping into the hallway from the stairwell, but the person never fully appeared on camera, just the shadow, moving across the floor, then disappearing again. I paused the video and checked the timestamp, 2:11 a.m. The problem was, it hadn't happened yet. The recording was showing something that wouldn't occur for another 28 minutes. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen for a while. Security systems glitch sometimes. Timestamps get messed up. But something about the video bothered me. The shadow moved slowly, like someone stepping carefully out of the stairwell, almost like they were trying not to be seen. I checked the live feed from that same camera. The hallway was empty, completely still, no movement. Then I noticed something else. The recording timeline showed another motion event scheduled later. At 2:26 a.m., I clicked that one. The video loaded. This time, the hallway wasn't empty. Someone was standing in the middle of the floor, facing the camera. But the image was dark and grainy. The person looked tall, thin, standing perfectly still. The timestamp again read 2:26 a.m. I checked the clock. It was 1:48 a.m., and the person in the video hadn't appeared in the building yet. For a few seconds, I just sat there staring at the screen. The image on the recording showed someone standing in the middle of the third-floor hallway, perfectly still, facing the camera. But according to the timestamp, that moment wouldn't happen for another 38 minutes. I checked the clock again. 1:48 a.m. The hallway camera live feed still showed nothing. Just an empty corridor and a row of office doors. I told myself the same thing anyone would. The system was glitching. The timestamps were probably wrong. Maybe the recording was from earlier in the night and the software had mixed the times up. Still, something about it bothered me. Because if the recording really was from earlier, I should have seen that person already. And I hadn't. The building had been empty all night. I decided the easiest way to settle it was to check the third floor myself. So I grabbed the flashlight from the desk and headed toward the stairwell. The building was quiet the way office buildings always are after hours. Just the hum of the lights and the faint sound of the ventilation system. I climbed the stairs slowly and pushed open the door to the third floor. The hallway lights were on. Everything looked normal. Empty offices on both sides, glass doors reflecting the overhead lights. I walked down the hallway toward the camera that had recorded the motion. No one was there. The emergency exit door at the far end was still locked. The stairwell door behind me was closed. I walked the entire floor just to be sure. Nothing. No people. No open doors. No signs that anyone had been there. After a few minutes, I went back downstairs. When I returned to the security office, the first thing I did was look at the clock. 2:09 a.m. 2 minutes until the timestamp on the first recording. I sat down in front of the monitors again. My eyes stayed fixed on the camera showing the third-floor hallway. Everything was still. 2:10 a.m., nothing moved. 2:11 a.m., and then it happened. Exactly like the recording showed. A shadow moved across the hallway floor, slowly sliding out from the stairwell door. I leaned closer to the screen. The shadow looked exactly the same as it had in the recorded video. Someone stepping into the hallway, but the door itself never opened. The shadow appeared first, then disappeared, just like in the recording. My stomach tightened because now I knew something for sure. The recording hadn't been wrong. It had been early, it had shown something that was going to happen, and it had been completely accurate. I looked back at the list of motion recordings on the system. The next one was still there. 2:26 a.m. The clip showing the person standing in the hallway. I checked the clock again. 2:13 a.m., 13 minutes away. For the next several minutes, I didn't look away from the monitor. The hallway stayed empty. The lights buzzed softly. Nothing moved. But the closer the clock got to 2:26, the more uneasy I felt, because I already knew what the camera was going to show. Someone standing there, watching the camera, watching me. At 2:25, I leaned forward in my chair. The hallway was still empty. The clock ticked to 2:26 a.m., and right on time. Someone stepped into view, exactly where the recording had shown. Standing in the middle of the hallway, facing the camera. The person didn't move, didn't walk, just stood there. The image was grainy, but I could tell it was a man, tall, thin, standing perfectly still. I stared at the screen. trying to understand how someone could have entered the building without triggering any other cameras. The front entrance hadn't opened. None of the stairwell doors had moved. Yet, there he was, standing in the hallway. Then, something else happened. The man slowly lifted his head and looked directly at the camera. For a moment, he stayed that way, just staring. Then he raised one hand and pointed straight at the lens. I felt a chill run through my chest because the camera he was pointing at was the one I was watching. Then the motion recording ended. The hallway went back to normal, empty. I sat there for a moment trying to process what I had just seen. Then I noticed something new on the screen. Another motion event had appeared in the system log. A new recording. Timestamp 2:32 a.m. I clicked it. The video opened. The first thing I saw was the inside of the security office. My office. The camera above the door had been triggered, and on the recording, the office door slowly opened. The timestamp in the corner read 2:32 a.m. I looked at the clock. It said 2:27. 5 minutes before the door in that video would open, and before I could even move, I heard the handle behind me begin to turn. The next story came from someone who noticed something unusual about their surroundings. At first, they assumed it was nothing. This happened a couple of years ago when I was traveling for work. My job required me to visit different cities a few times a year, and most of the time the company would just book whatever hotel was closest to the office I needed to visit. That trip had taken me to a small city about 4 hours away from where I lived. Nothing unusual about the place. Just a normal business hotel off the highway. 3 floors, long hallways. The kind of place that mostly hosted people traveling for work. I checked in around 9:30 that night. The front desk clerk handed me a key card and told me my room was on the 3rd floor. Room 317. The hotel was pretty quiet. Only a few cars in the parking lot. When I got to the 3rd floor, the hallway looked almost empty. Just rows of closed doors and dim lighting. I walked down the hall, found my room, and used the key card. The lock beeped once and the door opened. Everything inside looked normal. Bed, desk, small television. Standard hotel room. I dropped my bag, turned on the lights, and settled in for the night. By 11 p.m., I was already getting ready to go to sleep. I had an early meeting the next morning and planned to leave before sunrise. Before getting into bed, I checked the door. The electronic lock clicked when I closed it, and I flipped the small metal security latch on the inside. Just a habit whenever I stay in hotels. Then I turned off the lights and went to sleep. The first time the door beeped, I thought I was dreaming. The sound was soft. Just a quick electronic chirp. The same sound the lock makes when a keycard is used. At first, I didn't move. I was still half asleep. Then the handle on the door moved. Slowly, like someone trying to open it. I sat up immediately. The room was dark. The door didn't open. After a moment, the handle stopped moving, and everything went quiet again. I waited for a few seconds, listening. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself it had probably been someone at the wrong room. That happens in hotels all the time. People get confused about the room number, especially late at night. So I lay back down and tried to sleep. About 20 minutes later, it happened again. The same sound, beep. The electronic lock activating. Then the door handle turning. This time, I was fully awake. I sat up in the bed and looked toward the door. The security latch was still locked. The door moved slightly but couldn't open. Then the handle stopped again. Whoever was outside didn't knock, didn't say anything, just tried the door. After a few seconds, I heard footsteps in the hallway, walking away. That was when the situation started to feel strange, because if someone had the wrong room, They would usually knock or apologize, or at least say something. But whoever had tried the door hadn't made a single sound. I got out of bed and walked quietly toward the door. I looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. Just the dim overhead lights and rows of closed doors. No one there. I stood there for a minute, listening. Then I went back to bed. But now I was fully awake, and I couldn't stop thinking about the sound of the lock. Because the door hadn't just been pushed, the lock had activated. Someone had used a key card. Around 2 a.m., it happened again. The same electronic beep. The same slow movement of the handle. But this time, something was different. Instead of stopping immediately, the handle kept moving, back and forth, like someone was trying repeatedly to open the door. The metal latch rattled slightly as the pressure pushed against it. I sat there in the dark, completely still, listening. The handle moved again, then again. Whoever was outside clearly believed the door should open. Eventually, the sound stopped. Then, I heard something else. The faint sound of a keycard sliding against the lock again. Another beep. Then silence. No footsteps. No movement in the hallway, just the quiet of the hotel. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, waiting. But the door didn't beep again. The next morning, I went downstairs to the front desk before leaving for my meeting. The same clerk from the night before was working. I told him what had happened. Someone kept trying to get into my room last night. He frowned. Did they knock? No, they just kept using a key card. That made him look confused. He typed something into the computer, then looked back at me. That shouldn't be possible. Why not? He turned the monitor slightly so I could see the screen. This system logs every keycard that opens a door. He pointed to the log for room 317. According to the system, only one keycard had been issued for that room. Mine. And the log showed that same keycard unlocking the door multiple times during the night. 1:14 a.m., 1:37 a.m., 2:03 a.m. each time. The system said the door had been opened by the same card I was holding in my hand, but I had been inside the room the entire time, and when I checked my wallet that morning, my key card had never left it. For a moment, I thought the clerk had to be mistaken. I took the card out of my wallet and set it on the counter. "That's the only one you gave me." He nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's what the system says." He refreshed the screen again, like he expected the log to change, but it didn't. The same entries were still there. 3 separate times during the night, the door to my room had been unlocked, and every single entry showed the same keycard ID, the one sitting on the counter in front of us. I pointed at the screen, but I was inside the room when those happened. The clerk leaned back slightly in his chair. "That's weird." He clicked through a few more screens on the computer. "There's also a camera in that hallway." That caught my attention immediately. "You can check it?" "Yeah." He opened another program on the computer. A list of cameras appeared on the screen. Parking lot, lobby, elevators, 3rd floor hallway. He clicked the hallway camera and brought up the overnight footage. The video loaded. The hallway looked exactly the way I remembered it. Long, quiet, dim lights reflecting off the carpet. He fast-forwarded to the first timestamp in the log, 1:14 a.m. We both leaned closer to the screen. The video showed the hallway outside my room. Everything was empty. Then the lock on my door beeped. I could hear it faintly through the recording. The handle moved, just like it had when I was inside the room. But the hallway was completely empty. No one standing there, no one near the door. Just the handle turning on its own. The clerk stopped the video. We looked at each other. "Maybe the camera glitched," he said. But his voice didn't sound very confident. He skipped ahead to the next timestamp, 1:37 a.m. Again, the hallway was empty. The door to my room was closed. Then the lock beeped. The handle turned slowly. The door pushed against the metal latch from the inside. Exactly like I had seen it. But there was still no one there. Nothing in the hallway, no shadow, no movement, nothing. The clerk frowned and skipped to the last timestamp, 2:03 a.m. This time, the video started a few seconds before the door beeped. The hallway camera showed the same empty corridor, but just before the lock activated, something appeared at the far end of the hallway. Not a person exactly, more like a dark shape. It moved slowly across the floor near the wall, like a shadow sliding along the carpet. The clerk paused the video. "What is that?" I leaned closer to the screen. The shape didn't look like a person walking. There were no legs, no clear form, just something darker than the hallway moving closer to my door. Then the lock beeped. The handle turned. The door pushed against the latch again. The shadow stayed on the floor near the door for a moment, then slowly moved away down the hallway and disappeared. The clerk sat back in his chair. Neither of us said anything for a few seconds. Then he cleared his throat. "That's probably just the lighting." I nodded slowly, but I knew it wasn't the lighting, because I had been inside that room, listening to someone try to open the door. I went to my meeting that morning and tried not to think about it. By the time I got back to the hotel that evening, the situation felt less frightening, more confusing than anything. Maybe the camera had created a strange shadow. Maybe the door lock had malfunctioned. I picked up a new key card from the front desk just in case. The clerk from earlier wasn't there anymore. A different employee handed me the card. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. "Just lost my key earlier." She nodded and handed it over. I went upstairs and unlocked the door to room 317 again. The lock beeped. The door opened. Everything inside looked exactly the same. I shut the door and flipped the security latch again before going to bed. That night, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know what time it was. The room was completely dark, but something had woken me. Then I heard it. The electronic beep of the door lock. I sat up immediately. The handle moved, slowly. The metal latch rattled as the door pushed against it. I grabbed my phone and looked at the screen. 2:03 a.m. The same time as the last entry in the security log. The handle moved again, back and forth. Then it stopped. After a moment, I heard the soft beep of the lock again. Another attempt. The door pushed against the latch once more. Then the hallway went silent. No footsteps, no voices, nothing. I didn't move for several minutes. Eventually, the silence became too much. I got out of bed and walked toward the door. Slowly, carefully. My hand hovered near the latch. Then I looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty, just like the night before, but something was different. On the carpet, directly in front of my door, was my old key card. The one I had used the night before, the one I had left at the front desk that morning. It was lying on the floor, right outside my door, like someone had just dropped it there. But the hallway camera had already shown that no one had been standing there. When this person first noticed what was happening, they believed it had to be a coincidence. But coincidences usually don't repeat themselves. This happened about a year ago, when I was selling some furniture online before moving to a new apartment. I had listed a few things on one of those local marketplace apps. Nothing expensive, just things I didn't want to take with me. A desk, a small bookshelf, a couple of chairs. Most of the messages I got were normal. People asking if the items were still available. trying to negotiate the price, setting up times to pick things up. After a few days, I had sold almost everything, except for the desk. Late one night, around 11:45 p.m., I got a message about it. The notification popped up on my phone. The message said, "Is the desk still available?" The account didn't have a profile picture, just a blank circle where the photo should be. That wasn't unusual, though. Lots of people don't upload photos. So I replied, "Yes, it's still available." A few seconds later, another message came through. "Where are you located?" I sent the general area of my neighborhood. Not the exact address, just the closest intersection. The conversation paused for about a minute. Then the person replied again. Okay, that was it. No other questions. No attempt to arrange a time to pick it up. Just, okay. At first, I thought the person had probably lost interest. That happens all the time with online listings. People message you and then disappear. So I locked my phone and went to sleep. The next morning, I noticed something strange. There was another message from the same account. It had been sent at 2:14 a.m. The message said, "I'm close." I frowned when I read it, because I hadn't given the person my address, only the general intersection, which still covered several blocks. I didn't respond. A few minutes later, another message appeared. "I can see your building." That made me uncomfortable. My listing didn't include any photos taken outside, only pictures of the desk inside my living room. There was nothing in the post that showed where I lived, so I typed a reply. "What do you mean?" The message showed as delivered, but the person didn't respond. For several hours, nothing else happened. Eventually, I tried to ignore it. Maybe the person was just messing with me. Maybe they were guessing. Still, the messages kept bothering me, especially the way they were worded. "I'm close. I can see your building." That evening, I got another message. Same account, same blank profile picture. The message said, "You moved the desk." I stared at the phone for a moment. Because that morning I had moved the desk from the living room into the hallway, just to clear space, but there was no way the person could know that, unless they had been inside the apartment or watching it. Only 6 apartments, 2 on each floor, and I knew most of the people who lived there. I walked to the window and looked outside. The parking lot was dimly lit. A couple of cars were parked along the curb. Nothing unusual, no one standing around, no one watching the building. I looked back at the phone. Another message appeared. "You're looking out the window." I froze. I hadn't said anything, hadn't sent a message. But the person knew exactly what I was doing. I stepped away from the window immediately. My mind started racing. There were only a few ways someone could know that. Either they were watching from another building, or they were inside. I typed quickly. "Which apartment are you in?" The message sent. Several seconds passed. Then the typing indicator appeared again. This time, the reply came almost instantly. "Yours?" I felt my chest tighten. For a moment, I just stood there staring at the screen. Then I slowly turned and looked down the hallway. The desk was still there, the hallway was empty. But the message had said something else earlier. "You moved the desk," which meant whoever had sent the message had seen the hallway after I moved it. I stepped toward the bedroom and grabbed the baseball bat I kept beside the bed. My apartment wasn't big, just a living room, kitchen, bedroom, and bathroom. 4 small rooms. If someone was inside, there weren't many places they could hide. I started with the bathroom. Nothing, just the sink and the shower curtain. Then I checked the bedroom closet. Empty. I moved slowly through the kitchen. No one there either. Every cabinet, every corner, nothing. Finally, I stepped back into the hallway, and that was when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The desk drawer was slightly open, just a few inches. I was certain it had been closed earlier. Slowly, I pulled the drawer open the rest of the way. Inside was my phone charger, some papers, and something else. A second phone, an older model, one I didn't recognize. The screen was on, and on the screen was the same conversation I'd been having, the same messages, from the same blank account. My phone buzzed in my hand. A new message appeared, sent from the account. I slowly looked down at the second phone inside the desk drawer. The screen lit up at the exact same moment, and a new message appeared. I told you. I'm still here. I typed another message. How do you know that? For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the typing indicator appeared, 3 dots. Someone writing a reply. It stayed there for a long time, almost a full minute. Then the message finally appeared. Because I'm still here. When I read the message, I felt that cold, sinking feeling in my stomach that you get when something suddenly stops making sense. Because I'm still here. I stared at the phone for a long time. Part of me assumed it had to be a joke. Some random person trying to scare me. But the problem was the desk message. You moved the desk. No one could have known that. The photos in the listing were from days earlier, and no one had been inside my apartment since then, at least no one that I knew about. I stood up slowly and looked around the room. The apartment was quiet, just the low hum of the refrigerator and the sound of cars passing outside. I walked down the short hallway and checked the front door, still locked. The deadbolt was in place. I checked the chain lock too, still secured. Then I looked toward the desk. It was exactly where I had moved it earlier that day, sitting halfway down the hallway, blocking part of the wall, nothing unusual about it. Still, the message kept repeating in my head, because I'm still here. I went back to my phone and opened the conversation again. The account name was still blank. No profile picture, no location. Just the messages. I tapped on the profile to see if there was any information. Nothing. The account had been created that same day. No listings, no reviews, no history, just the messages to me. I typed another response. What do you mean you're still here? The message sent. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the typing indicator appeared again. 3 dots. The person was writing. The message came through slowly. I told you. A second message appeared right after it. I'm in the building. My heart started beating faster. Because the building I lived in was small, the message attached to this story contained only one sentence. I still don't know how to explain what had happened that night. This happened a few years ago when I was working late shifts in the city. I didn't own a car at the time, so most nights I took the bus home. Usually, it wasn't a problem. The route ran every 30 minutes until midnight. But if you missed that last bus, you were basically stuck waiting for hours. One night, I stayed late at work, finishing a project and barely made it to the bus stop. When I got there, the street was almost empty. Just a single streetlight and the small glass bus shelter. The city gets strangely quiet late at night, especially during the week. I checked the time on my phone, 11:57 p.m. The last bus was scheduled for midnight. For a few minutes, nothing happened. No cars, no pedestrians, just the distant sound of traffic somewhere farther down the road. Then headlights appeared at the end of the street. The bus. It rolled slowly toward the stop and pulled up in front of the shelter. The doors opened with a loud hiss. I stepped inside. At first I thought the bus was empty, but after my eyes adjusted to the dim lighting, I realized there was someone sitting near the back. A man. He was sitting on the left side, a few rows from the rear door. His head was tilted slightly forward, like he was looking at the floor. I didn't think much about it. Late buses usually have 1 or 2 random passengers. I paid the fare and walked toward the middle of the bus. The driver didn't say anything, didn't even look up, just stared forward through the windshield. The doors closed and the bus started moving again. For the first few minutes, everything felt normal. The bus drove through several empty intersections, stopping occasionally at red lights, but no one else got on and no one got off. Eventually, I noticed something strange. The man in the back hadn't moved at all, not once. No shifting in his seat, no looking out the window, nothing. He was just sitting there with his head tilted forward, perfectly still. At first, I thought he might be asleep, but the longer I watched, the more unsettling it started to feel. Because even sleeping people move sometimes, adjusting, breathing, doing something. This guy didn't move at all. Then I noticed something else. We had already passed 3 stops where people usually got off, but the driver hadn't opened the doors once. The bus just kept moving, through empty streets, past dark buildings, like it wasn't following the normal route anymore. I stood up and walked toward the front of the bus. "Excuse me," I said to the driver. He didn't respond, didn't turn his head, just kept staring forward. "Hey," I said again. Still nothing. That was when I looked at the driver's reflection in the windshield and realized something was wrong. Because the driver's hands weren't on the wheel, they were resting in his lap, and the bus was still driving itself. For a second, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The reflection in the windshield was faint because of the darkness outside, but I could see the driver clearly enough. His hands were resting in his lap, not even near the steering wheel. Yet the bus continued to move smoothly down the road, closer to the front. "Hey," I said again. Still nothing. The driver didn't turn his head, didn't react, didn't even blink. That's when I noticed something else. His eyes were open, but they weren't focused on the road. They looked empty, like he wasn't actually seeing anything. I felt a chill run through my chest. I looked down at the dashboard. The speedometer showed the bus moving at about 35 miles per hour. But the driver's foot wasn't on the pedals either. The bus was just moving on its own. I grabbed the pole beside the driver's seat and looked through the windshield. The street ahead stretched into darkness. A few streetlights flickered past as we drove under them. But something felt wrong about the road. The route we were on should have turned left 2 blocks back. Instead, the bus kept going straight, further away from the downtown area, further away from the normal route. I turned and looked back toward the passenger sitting in the rear of the bus. The man was still there, still sitting in the same position, head tilted forward, not moving, not breathing visibly, just sitting there like a statue. I walked halfway down the aisle toward him. "Hey," I called out. No response. The bus continued rolling through the empty streets. I got closer. Now I could see the man's face more clearly. His skin looked pale under the dim overhead lights, almost gray. His eyes were open too, but just like the driver's, they looked unfocused, like he wasn't actually aware of anything around him. I stopped a few feet away. "Are you okay?" I asked. Still nothing. The man didn't react, didn't blink, didn't move. That was when I noticed the smell. Faint, but unmistakable. Like something old, something that had been sitting too long in the heat. My stomach tightened. I stepped backward, slowly. Something about the man felt completely wrong. I turned and looked toward the front of the bus again. The driver was still sitting exactly the same way, hands in his lap, eyes open, not moving. and the bus kept driving. But now the road outside looked unfamiliar. The buildings had disappeared. The streetlights were spaced farther apart. We were leaving the city. I hurried back to the front of the bus. "Stop the bus," I said loudly. The driver didn't respond, didn't even shift in his seat. I reached toward his shoulder, but I hesitated before touching him, because the closer I got, the stronger that smell became. The same smell I had noticed near the passenger. Something was very wrong. Then I saw the digital route display above the windshield. The bright orange letters scrolled slowly across the screen. Normally, it showed the route number and final destination. But this time, the message was different. It read, "Final stop." Then the text changed. New letters scrolled across the display. "No return route." I stared at the sign, confused. That wasn't a normal message. Public buses don't display things like that. They show street names, stations, neighborhoods. Not that. I looked back out the windshield. The road ahead was darker now. The last streetlight passed above us, and after that, there were no more lights at all. Just the beam of the bus headlights cutting through empty road. Then something behind me moved. For the first time since I got on the bus. A slow scraping sound, like someone shifting in a seat. I turned around slowly. The passenger in the back of the bus had lifted his head. His eyes were now fixed directly on me, and his mouth slowly opened. Then he spoke in a dry, quiet voice. "You weren't supposed to get on this one." This next story started with something most people would probably ignore, but ignoring it turned out to be a mistake. This started happening about 3 years ago when I was living in a small house on the edge of town. The neighborhood was quiet, just one long street with maybe 20 houses on it. Most of the people who lived there had been around for years. It was the kind of place where you recognized almost every car that drove by, because very few people had any reason to be on that road unless they lived there. The first time I noticed the car was late at night. Around 11:30 p.m., I had just turned off the living room lights and was getting ready for bed when I saw headlights pass across the front windows. That wasn't unusual by itself. Sometimes people use the street to turn around, but a few seconds later the headlights passed the house again. Slower this time. The car rolled past like the driver was looking at something. I walked to the window and looked outside. It was an older, dark-colored sedan. Hard to tell exactly what model. It drove slowly down the street and disappeared around the corner. I didn't think much about it. Until the next night. The following evening, I was sitting on the couch watching TV when I saw the headlights again. Same time. Just after 11:30 p.m., the same dark sedan rolled slowly past the house. Again, it looked like the driver was scanning the houses. The car reached the end of the street, turned around, and drove back the other direction. This time, it passed even slower. Then, it disappeared again. That was when I started paying attention, because 2 nights in a row, at almost the exact same time, the same car had driven past my house twice. Over the next week, it kept happening, every night. Between 11:20 and 11:40 p.m., the sedan would appear at the end of the street, drive slowly past the houses, turn around, then drive back. Sometimes the headlights would dim slightly as it passed, like the driver was easing off the gas, watching. After about the 5th night, I stepped outside once the car passed. I wanted to see where it went. But by the time I reached the driveway, it was already gone. The street would be completely empty again, no sound, no other cars, just silence. That's when the situation started to feel strange, because whoever was driving that car clearly wasn't visiting anyone. They never stopped, never parked, never got out, they just drove past every night, at almost the exact same time. One night, I decided to stay outside and wait. I sat on the front steps around 11:15 p.m., just watching the street. About 15 minutes later, I saw headlights appear at the end of the road, the same car. The sedan moved slowly toward my house. As it got closer, I stood up. The driver saw me, because the car slowed even more, almost to a stop. The windows were tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. For a moment, the car just idled in front of the house. Then it started moving again, rolling past slowly. I turned to watch it drive away. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The car didn't have a license plate. Not on the back, not on the front. Just empty brackets where the plate should have been. And as the car reached the end of the street, the brake lights came on. The sedan stopped, then slowly began backing up the road, straight toward my house again. When the car started backing up the street, I didn't move. I just stood there at the end of my driveway watching it come toward me. The reverse lights glowed white in the darkness. Slow, steady. The sedan rolled backward until it was directly in front of my house again. Then it stopped. The engine kept running. For a moment, nothing happened. The windows were so dark I couldn't see inside. Not the driver, not even a silhouette. Just black glass reflecting the porch light. I felt that uneasy pressure in my chest that tells you something isn't right. Finally, I stepped a little closer to the road. The car didn't move, it just sat there, idling. Then suddenly the driver shifted gears. The car jerked forward and accelerated down the street. Within seconds, the taillights disappeared around the corner. I stood there for another minute before going back inside. I locked the front door, checked the windows, and tried to convince myself it had just been someone messing around, maybe a teenager, maybe someone lost. But the next night, the car came back. This time, I didn't go outside. I watched from the living room window with the lights off. At 11:31 p.m., the headlights appeared again, the same sedan. It rolled slowly down the street, past the houses, past my driveway. Then it reached the end of the block and turned around, just like every other night. But this time it stopped directly in front of my house again. The engine idled. The headlights stayed pointed toward the driveway, like the driver was staring at the house. I stood completely still behind the curtain, waiting, watching. After about 30 seconds, the car moved again and drove away. The next day, I mentioned it to my neighbor across the street. He had lived there longer than I had. "Have you seen a dark sedan driving around late at night?" I asked him. He frowned slightly. "The one without the license plate?" That immediately got my attention. "You've seen it too?" He nodded. "Been driving through here for weeks." Weeks, my stomach tightened, because I had only started noticing it recently. "How long?" I asked. He shrugged. "Maybe a month, maybe longer." Then he said something that made the situation feel even worse. "I figured it was someone visiting you." "Me?" "Yeah," he said. "It always slows down in front of your house." That night, I decided to set up a small camera near the front window. Just a cheap security camera I had bought a while back but never used. I pointed it toward the street and let it record. Then I waited. At 11:29 p.m., the headlights appeared again, the same sedan. It drove slowly past the house, turned around, then stopped again in front of the driveway. But this time, something different happened. The driver's door opened, for the first time since I had been seeing the car. Someone stepped out. The person stood beside the car for a moment. Tall, thin, wearing dark clothing. Even from the window, I couldn't make out their face. They slowly looked toward my house, toward the front window, toward me, even though the lights were off. Then the person walked around to the back of the car and opened the trunk. My stomach tightened. because they didn't take anything out. They just stood there, looking inside, like they were checking something. Then they closed the trunk again, got back into the car, and drove away. The next morning, I checked the footage from the camera. The video showed everything clearly. The car, the driver stepping out, the trunk opening. But there was one detail I hadn't noticed the night before. When the trunk opened, the inside light turned on, and the camera caught a brief glimpse inside. There was something in the trunk, something large, wrapped tightly in plastic, long, almost the length of the trunk itself. And as the driver stood there looking down at it, they slowly lifted their head and stared directly into my camera. The person who sent this story said the situation didn't seem strange at first, until they realized something about it didn't make sense. This happened about 2 years ago, when I was in the middle of moving apartments. My new place wasn't ready yet, so I had to put most of my furniture and boxes into a storage unit for a couple of weeks. The facility I chose was on the edge of town, rows of long metal buildings with roll-up doors, the kind of place where every unit looks exactly the same. The manager gave me a key and assigned me Unit 214. It was in the middle row, about halfway down the building. The first day I moved everything in was completely normal. I filled the unit with boxes, a mattress, a dresser, and a few smaller pieces of furniture. Once everything was inside, I pulled the metal door down and locked it with the padlock they provided. The facility was open 24 hours, so people came and went at all times. Still, most evenings it was pretty quiet, especially after dark. For the first few days, I didn't return. There was no reason to. All my things were already inside. But about a week later, I needed to grab a box with some paperwork in it. So I drove over there around 8:30 at night. The facility was mostly empty. Only a couple of cars in the lot. The rows of storage buildings were lit by tall floodlights mounted on poles. The lights made everything look a little too bright, like daylight trapped inside a cage of shadows. I walked down the long row until I reached Unit 214 and immediately noticed something strange. My lock was hanging open. At first, I thought maybe I had forgotten to secure it, but I was certain I had locked it the day I left. Still, the door itself was closed, so I lifted the metal handle and rolled the door upward. The inside looked the same as before. Boxes stacked along the walls, mattress leaning upright, furniture exactly where I had left it. Nothing looked missing. I grabbed the box I needed and carried it out to my car. Before leaving, I shut the door and locked it again. This time, I double-checked it, pulling on the handle to make sure it was secure. 2 days later, I came back again. This time, during the afternoon. The sun was still up. The lot had a few more people moving things in and out of their units. When I walked down the road toward 214, I noticed something before I even reached the door. My lock was open again, just hanging there, exactly the way it had been before. My stomach tightened, because I knew I had locked it. I had even checked it twice before leaving. I walked over and opened the door slowly. At first, nothing looked different, but after a few seconds I realized something had changed. One of the boxes had been moved. The box that had originally been near the back wall was now sitting closer to the entrance. It wasn't a big change, but it was definitely in a different place. For a moment, I just stood there staring at it, trying to remember exactly how things had been stacked before. Then I noticed something else. There was a small plastic water bottle sitting on top of one of the boxes. It wasn't mine. I hadn't brought any drinks when I moved things in, and the bottle looked half empty, like someone had been drinking from it recently. That's when the situation stopped feeling like a mistake, because someone had definitely been inside my storage unit, and judging by the water bottle, They hadn't just stopped by for a moment. They had stayed long enough to drink something. I walked deeper into the unit and started checking the boxes. Nothing seemed stolen. Everything was still there. But the longer I stood inside that small metal space, the more uneasy I started to feel, because storage units are quiet places, even during the day. And as I stood there listening, I realized I could hear something, a slow movement, somewhere above me, coming from the ceiling, like someone shifting their weight, right over the top of my unit. At first, I thought the sound above me might have been something simple, maybe a bird on the roof, or the metal expanding in the afternoon heat. But the sound came again, a slow, scraping noise, like something dragging lightly across the ceiling. I looked up. The roof of the unit was made from thin sheets of metal supported by steel beams. Above that was an empty gap before the outer roof of the building, just dark space. I stood still for a moment listening. Then the sound stopped. Everything went quiet again. For a few seconds, I tried to convince myself I was imagining it. Storage buildings make strange noises sometimes. But then I remembered the water bottle and the moved box. Someone had been inside my unit. That part was no longer a question. I stepped outside and looked down the long row of doors. 2 people were loading furniture into a unit farther down. Other than that, the place was empty. No one standing near the roof. No one climbing around. Nothing that explained the sound I had heard. I pulled the metal door down and locked the unit again. This time, I stood there for a minute, staring up at the roof line. The top of the building was just a long stretch of metal panels. No windows, no openings. At least none that I could see. Still, the sound had definitely come from above. Later that evening, I stopped by the office near the front gate. The manager was sitting behind the desk, looking through paperwork. "Quick question," I said. "Is there any way someone could get into a storage unit without opening the door?" He looked up. "Not unless they cut the lock." I shook my head. My lock was open twice this week. He frowned slightly. "Did you leave it unlocked?" "No." He leaned back in his chair and thought about it. Then he said something that made my stomach tighten. "Well, the buildings aren't completely sealed at the top." "What do you mean?" "There's a gap between the unit walls and the outer roof." "For ventilation." "So someone could climb over?" He shrugged. "In theory, yeah. But they'd have to get on the roof first." I didn't like the way that sounded. "Has that ever happened before?" "Not that I know of," he said. "But if someone was determined enough, they could probably move across the beams up there." I imagined the dark space above the rows of units. Someone crawling slowly across the metal framework, moving from one storage unit to another, listening, watching. The thought made my skin crawl. That night, I decided to go back to the unit one more time. I wanted to make sure everything was secure. By the time I arrived, the facility was almost empty. The sun had already set. The floodlights along the rows had turned on. Long shadows stretched across the pavement. I walked down the row toward Unit 214. The air felt cooler now, quieter. As I got closer to the door, I noticed something that made me stop. My lock was still in place, still closed. But the metal door itself was raised slightly, just a few inches off the ground, like someone inside had pushed it up. My chest tightened, because when I locked it earlier, the door had been completely shut. I stepped closer and grabbed the handle. Slowly, I lifted the door the rest of the way. The inside of the unit looked mostly the same. Boxes, mattress, furniture. But now, there was something else. In the back corner of the unit, someone had laid out a blanket. Next to it were 2 more empty water bottles and a small flashlight, like someone had been using the space to sleep. My heart started pounding. I backed out of the unit immediately and turned toward the office. I was about to start walking when I heard it again, the same scraping sound directly above me. This time it was louder, metal shifting, something moving slowly across the beams. I looked up toward the dark ceiling above the storage units, and just for a second, I saw something move in the narrow gap between the roof panels, a hand sliding slowly along the beam, then disappearing back into the darkness. And above me, something began crawling across the ceiling again, right over the top of my unit. Some of the stories people send me include details that make them difficult to explain. This next one is one of those. A couple years ago, I went on a weekend camping trip in a national forest, about 3 hours from where I lived. It was a place I'd been going to for years, nothing fancy, just a quiet stretch of forest with a few unofficial campsites along a dirt road. The area was pretty remote. Once you drove past the last ranger station, there was almost no cell service, which was part of the reason I liked going there. It was quiet. No crowds, no constant noise from other campers, just trees and the occasional wildlife. I arrived late in the afternoon and set up my tent near a small clearing about 50 yards from the road. The spot was surrounded by tall pine trees, and a narrow trail ran through the woods nearby. While I was setting up camp, I noticed something attached to one of the trees near the trail. A small camouflaged box strapped to the trunk. It was a trail camera, the kind hunters use to photograph animals moving through an area. That wasn't unusual. People leave those out all the time. The camera was pointed down the trail, probably to catch deer or elk passing through. I didn't think much about it. The camera was about 30 feet from where my tent was going to be. Close enough that it could probably see the edge of my campsite, but I figured whoever owned it would come back eventually to collect it. I finished setting up the tent and started a small fire as the sun went down. The forest grew darker quickly once the light disappeared behind the trees. By the time I finished eating dinner, the clearing was lit only by the fire and a small lantern I had hanging near the tent. Around 10:30 p.m., I put the fire out and climbed into my sleeping bag. The forest was quiet, just the sound of wind moving through the branches, and occasionally something small moving through the brush nearby. Probably squirrels or raccoons. I fell asleep pretty quickly. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. At first, I didn't know why. The inside of the tent was completely dark. My watch said 2:18 a.m., then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, careful, moving through the leaves outside. I held still and listened. The steps moved across the clearing and then stopped, right outside the tent. For several seconds there was no sound at all, just silence. Then the footsteps started again, moving away, heading toward the trail. Eventually, the sound faded into the forest. I lay there for a while listening, but nothing else happened. Eventually, I convinced myself it had probably just been another camper walking through the area, or maybe someone checking the trail camera. Still, something about the way the footsteps had stopped beside my tent made me uneasy, like whoever it was had been standing there, listening. The next morning, I packed up camp and headed home. Before leaving, I walked over to the trail camera, mostly out of curiosity. I wanted to see what kind of wildlife had passed through the area. Trail cameras usually have a small screen where you can scroll through the photos. I pressed the button on the side. The screen lit up. A series of images appeared. Deer walking along the trail, a raccoon, a fox, normal wildlife photos. Then I reached the images from the night before. The timestamp read 2:12 a.m. The first photo showed my campsite, the tent, the dying embers of the fire. Nothing unusual. The next photo was taken 10 seconds later, and this time there was someone standing at the edge of the clearing. Tall, thin, facing the camera. The face was too dark to see clearly, but the person was looking directly toward my tent. I pressed the button again. The next photo appeared. Timestamp 2:17 a.m. The person was closer now, standing just a few feet from the tent, looking down at it. I felt a chill run through my chest, because that meant the person had been standing outside my tent while I was inside sleeping. Then I pressed the button one more time. The final image loaded. Timestamp 2:18 a.m., the exact time I had woken up. But the photo didn't show the person walking away. It showed something much worse. The zipper of my tent, slowly opening from the outside. For a moment, I just stood there staring at the small screen on the trail camera. The last image showed the zipper of my tent opening slightly from the outside, just enough to create a small, dark gap. I felt that same cold tension in my chest that you get when something suddenly stops making sense. Because if the zipper had been opened, that meant someone had been standing right next to my tent, and I had been inside it, sleeping. I pressed the button again, hoping there were more photos, but the screen went back to the menu. That had been the final image. No picture of the person leaving. No photo of them walking away down the trail. Just the tent opening. I looked around the clearing instinctively. The forest was quiet in the morning light. Sunlight filtered through the tall trees. Birds moved through the branches overhead. Everything looked completely normal, but the photos on the camera said something very different had happened during the night. I stepped closer to the tent and examined the zipper carefully. It was closed now, exactly the way I remembered leaving it. But when I touched it, I noticed something strange. The zipper wasn't fully locked at the bottom. There was a small gap where the two sides didn't meet perfectly, like someone had opened it part way and then quickly pulled it shut again. My stomach tightened, because that meant the photo wasn't just a trick of lighting. Someone had actually touched the tent. I walked slowly around the campsite looking for footprints. The ground was covered in dry leaves and pine needles, which made it hard to see clear impressions. But near the edge of the clearing, I found something. A shallow indentation in the dirt, the shape of a shoe, facing toward the tent. A few feet away, there was another, and another, leading away toward the narrow trail. I followed them for a short distance, but the ground quickly became harder and the tracks disappeared. Eventually, I stopped and looked deeper into the forest. The trail twisted between the trees until it disappeared into the shadows. Whoever had been there was long gone now. Still, something about the situation bothered me, because people don't usually walk quietly through remote campsites in the middle of the night, especially without saying anything. If it had been another camper, they probably would have called out or apologized for waking me. But whoever this was had done the opposite. They had walked right up to my tent, opened the zipper, then disappeared into the forest, without making a sound. I drove home later that morning and tried to convince myself it had been a strange coincidence. Maybe someone had been curious about the campsite. Maybe they thought the tent was empty, but the photos from the trail camera stayed stuck in my mind, especially the one showing the person standing beside the tent, looking down at it. I kept wondering the same thing. What had they been planning to do after opening the zipper? And why had they stopped? 2 days later, I received a message that made the entire situation feel worse. The message came through email. The subject line said, "Trail camera photos inside," was a short message from someone claiming to own the camera I had found. They said they had recently checked the images remotely and noticed my campsite in the background. They wanted to apologize if the camera had invaded my privacy, but that wasn't the part that made my stomach drop. Attached to the email were several photos from the same night, photos that had been taken before the ones I had seen on the camera. The first image showed the clearing while I was sitting by the fire earlier that evening. The second showed my tent after the fire had gone out. The third photo had been taken around 1:47 a.m., and it showed something I hadn't known at the time. Someone standing behind my tent, completely still, facing the camera, watching the tent for more than 30 minutes before walking toward it. The final message in the email said, "I thought you might want to see these," because whoever that person was, they didn't come from the trail. They were already standing in the woods behind your tent when you arrived. The final story in this collection is one that stayed with me after I finished reading it, because even now, I'm not sure what the correct explanation could be. A couple of years ago, I started going to a gym that stayed open 24 hours. My work schedule was strange at the time, so the only time I could usually work out was late at night. Most nights, I would show up somewhere between 12:30 and 1 a.m. At that hour, the gym was almost always empty. Maybe one or two other people lifting weights. Sometimes no one at all. The building itself was large but simple. A front desk near the entrance, card scanners to get in. Then a big open workout floor with rows of machines, free weights, and mirrors covering most of the walls. In the back, there were locker rooms and a small hallway leading to a few offices. The first couple of weeks I went there, everything felt normal. Quiet. Peaceful. I actually liked working out late because I didn't have to wait for equipment. But then, I started noticing something strange. Every time I walked into the gym, someone was already there. A man I had never seen before. He was always using the treadmill closest to the mirrors along the far wall. The first time I noticed him, I assumed he had just arrived before me. But then, it kept happening. Every single night. No matter what time I came in. Sometimes 12:45, sometimes 1:10. Once even 2 o'clock in the morning. And every time I walked in, the man was already on the treadmill, running at the exact same pace. At first, I didn't think much about it. People have routines. Maybe he worked late like I did. But after a while, something about the situation started to feel strange. Because I never once saw him arrive. And I never once saw him leave. Even when I stayed at the gym for more than an hour. He would still be there, running, at the same steady pace, like he had never stopped. One night, I decided to pay closer attention. I arrived earlier than usual, around 12:20 a.m. The parking lot was completely empty except for my car. No other vehicles. I scanned my membership card and stepped inside. The front desk area was dark except for a small light behind the counter. And the gym floor was empty. No one on the machines. No one lifting weights. No one running on the treadmills. Just rows of equipment and the faint hum of the overhead lights. I walked over to one of the benches and started my workout. For about 10 minutes, I was completely alone in the building. Then I heard the sound, the steady rhythm of footsteps hitting a treadmill belt. I turned around. The man was there again, running on the treadmill near the mirrors, exactly where he always was. The problem was, I had never heard the front door open, and I had been facing the entrance the entire time. There was no way he could have walked in without me seeing him. Yet somehow, he was already there, running, just like every other night. For the next several minutes, I watched him carefully. The man never looked around, never checked his phone, never slowed down. He just kept running at the same speed, staring at his reflection in the mirror. Eventually, I walked over to the water fountain nearby, partly because I was thirsty, but mostly because it gave me an excuse to get closer to him. As I stepped onto the row of machines beside the treadmill, I finally got a clear look at his face, and immediately realized something was wrong, because the man wasn't watching himself run in the mirror. He was watching me through the reflection, and the moment our eyes met, the treadmill suddenly stopped, but the man's feet kept moving, like he was still running. For a moment, I thought I was imagining it. The treadmill belt had stopped. I could hear the motor winding down, but the man's legs kept moving, running in place, like the floor beneath him was still moving even though it clearly wasn't. The sound of his footsteps continued, soft, rhythmic, hitting the rubber surface of the treadmill that had already come to a stop. My chest tightened, because that shouldn't have been possible. When treadmills stop suddenly, people stumble, or grab the rails, or at least react. But this guy didn't react at all. He just kept running. His eyes stayed fixed on the mirror, watching me through the reflection. I stepped back slowly. The gym was silent except for the sound of his feet moving. Step, step, step. Then suddenly the sound stopped. The man froze, standing perfectly still on the treadmill. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then he slowly stepped off the machine, without looking away from the mirror. I turned around quickly and started walking toward the locker room hallway. Something about the situation had crossed from strange into something much worse. I just wanted to leave. But as I reached the hallway entrance, I heard footsteps behind me. Not running this time, walking, slow, measured, following. I glanced back. The man was walking across the gym floor toward me, still staring directly at me. I hurried into the hallway and pushed through the door to the locker room. The room was empty, rows of lockers, benches, fluorescent lights humming above. I walked quickly to my locker and grabbed my bag. Then I headed back toward the exit. When I stepped out onto the gym floor again, the man was gone. The treadmill stood empty. The gym was silent. For a moment, I wondered if he had simply left while I was in the locker room. But then I noticed something strange. The front entrance door was still closed, and the access scanner beside it still showed the green light from when I had entered earlier, meaning the door hadn't opened again, at least not recently. I walked slowly toward the front desk. There was a small security monitor there that showed the camera feeds for the gym. I had seen the staff use it before. Curious, and honestly a little unsettled, I leaned over the counter and looked at the screen. The monitor showed several camera views. The entrance, the workout floor, the hallway, the locker rooms. I rewound the recording from about 20 minutes earlier, back to when I first noticed the man running on the treadmill. The video loaded. It showed the gym floor exactly as I remembered it. The benches, the mirrors, the rows of machines, and me, working out alone. I leaned closer to the screen. The recording showed me lifting weights, walking toward the water fountain, turning to look at the treadmill. But the treadmill was empty, completely empty. There was no one running on it. No man, no movement. Just the machine sitting there. Exactly the same way it had been earlier when I first arrived. I skipped ahead in the footage. The video showed me walking across the gym floor, stopping near the treadmill, then suddenly stepping backward, like I had just seen something. Even though the machine was still empty, the footage continued. It showed me staring at nothing, then walking quickly toward the locker room hallway. Exactly the way I remembered doing, but the man who had followed me wasn't there. I stood there watching the screen, my stomach tightening, because the cameras showed only one person in the gym the entire time. Me. Then something else caught my attention. The timestamp on the footage. The recording was from 12:07 a.m., but according to the clock on the wall, it was already 1:14 a.m., which meant the cameras were running more than an hour behind. I scrolled further forward in the recording, trying to find the moment where I was standing at the front desk, looking at the monitor. Eventually, the footage reached the present time, and the camera view changed to the entrance area. The screen showed the front desk, the monitors, the door, and someone standing behind the counter, watching the camera. For a second, I didn't understand what I was seeing. Then, I realized. The person behind the counter wasn't me. It was the man from the treadmill, standing there, looking directly into the security camera, like he had been waiting for the footage to catch up.